Drawing knights in suits of armor is far from one of my strengths, design-wise. I know I do a lot of Dungeons & Dragons focused episodes on this channel, but in a lot of those episodes I'm not drawing characters in full suits of armor. I'm drawing characters with a bit of armor and lots of studded leather and cloaks and things like that. The only two characters I can think of off the top of my head that I gave full suits of armor to were Reinhardt and Batman. And I really like those drawings, but both of them are kind of generic-ish armors. And as I like to do in a lot of cases when I realize there's something that I think is cool that I'm not great at drawing or designing, I'm gonna do an episode where I draw a whole bunch of them. And this episode specifically, I thought the perfect case would be taking characters from Transformers and turning them into medieval-style knights. And instead of doing my usual thing of individual pieces, I'm gonna draw all four characters facing off in a big splash page image thing, whatever you want to call it. I'm excited to see how this works out. I hope it does make me more confident at drawing medieval knights. And if you're excited to see how this turns out as well, obligatory call for likes on the video. And subscribes, if you're not subscribed, but most of you who are seeing it early are. Anyway, let's jump straight into the layout, shall we? Now with these characters, even though it's one big unified piece, I'm going to do my usual thing of drawing the characters one at a time and fully flesh them out, then draw the background in behind them. But I had to still go in and make sure to block out all of their positions and poses ahead of time, because I wanted to make sure they all fit nicely into a composition. So I had to have the basic idea for each character and what characters I was going to draw. I've decided to do 2 Autobots and 2 Decepticons. Bumblebee and Optimus seemed like the obvious choices for the 2 Autobots, and then for Decepticons, I went with Megatron and Starscream. I also had to have the basic idea down for what weapons I was going to give each of them. Most of them it was pretty obvious. Starscream I had a bit of a hard time deciding, ended up going with a bow and arrow, which I guess makes him feel a little bit more ranger-like than knight-like, but I thought it was going to work well, and looking at the weapons he's had, it seemed to fit the best. These are all pretty rough, but I am going to stick with these poses, so let's take a look at the rough composition finished. Now often in episodes I'll switch up the order of the characters I'm drawing, but because I want to tell you all the process that I was learning about through drawing these, I want to actually show you the characters in order. So we're starting with Optimus, and for him I was going in with the mindset of him being sort of like a royal knight, maybe even a king who goes out into the battlefield with his warriors, but maybe not quite king, but just like very royal. And then I have Bumblebee in there, sort of like his squire slash also a knight in his own right, but we'll talk about him later. For Optimus, I knew I wanted to give him a big, awesome battle axe, which isn't necessarily what a knight would be using, but it's just the iconic weapon for Optimus when I think of melee weapons for him. You can see I have a reference image up there from one of the either War for Cybertron or Fall of Cybertron games, which is one of my favorite video games of all time. I really wish they would go back and remaster them for modern video game systems. But for the design of this armor, obviously I was looking at Optimus himself, and I was looking at a bunch of different Dungeons & Dragons Royal Knights. And another thing going into this drawing that I had to think about was, I've mentioned on the channel before how I've been a little bit stuck in this mindset with fantasy medieval characters to make them more desaturated than some of my other superhero-y kind of characters, and that's not a good mindset to go in with because there is a lot of bright saturated colors in medieval armor and designs and all that. So with this one I was like, okay, no, I'm going to avoid my instincts and go as bright and saturated as I would with any of my other drawings. And that came to mixed results on this character. I like how it ends up looking, but I think the way I use the really saturated colors makes it look a little bit more fantasy-like. Also, the way that I tried to incorporate the visual equivalent of Optimus's windows from his truck on the chest with this sort of rectangle-y shape, it didn't quite come together. It looks, I'd say, almost a little bit too much like Optimus and not enough like a medieval knight's armor. I am working in fantasy elements, but I want this to be a little bit more realistic-ish than some of my other sorts of designs for D&D episodes. So the design of the armor set isn't quite where I want it, but overall I do really like how the drawing's going so far. I think it's a good first step, and I'm going to try and shake things up a bit with Bumblebee, but here is Optimus. Next up, we've got Bumblebee, who I'm doing as a knight, but also a bit more of a squire, as I was saying earlier. So the images I was looking at for him were still some Dungeons and Dragons stuff, but also I was just looking at images of actual knights and squires outfits. And I was seeing that some of them don't really have the full armor plating on the chest. And while this is an armor episode, I wanted to do a bunch of different types of armor style design. So I decided to have a bit of a flowy, I was gonna say tapestry, that's probably not the right word, but like not a full armor set on the chest, and then have a bit of chainmail underneath that so we're still protecting his torso from damage. You can see, again, I was also referencing images from the Fall of Cybertron franchise, and then Bumblebee from the movie Bumblebee, because I really love that design. I think it's a really great update of his G1 design. Because Bumblebee is kind of working for Optimus in this drawing, and he's the squire kind of character, I made him a little bit younger looking, have his face exposed, and for the weapon on him, I decided to go with a short sword. It was a bit of a tough choice because Bumblebee has a variety of weapons that he's used, but his main melee weapon that I could think of was that short blade that pops out of his forearm. And I had actually considered having that on this character, like an Assassin's Creed style arm-mounted blade, but again, I was trying to lean a little bit more realistic knights. Obviously, that doesn't totally come across because of things like the color palette, I think, take away from that a little bit. Not the saturation necessarily, but the variety of colors I have between the different characters, but also just because I do tend to lean more fantasy, so that was bound to work its way in there a bit. And my style obviously leans a little bit more into fiction than reality. But regardless, I was trying to not lean into the fantasy too much, so I went with him holding a short sword instead of an arm-mounted sword. I also gave him a nice big round shield, and then on his forearms you can see I gave him they're almost like smaller shields. That's inspired by the arm design from Fall of Cybertron, because I really like that version of Bumblebee, and how he's got the big round circly things like his wheel equivalent when he's in his robot shape. I think I like this one better because it's a simpler design, but I don't necessarily want to do just simple armors in this episode. But definitely happy with how this is going. Hope you all like him too. Here's our Bumblebee Squire. Now we're on to the other half of the image with the Decepticons, and Starscream was the character that presented the most challenges to me in this episode, and I didn't think he would going in, but once I started thinking about Starscream, I realized that I didn't really have any idea what his original design looked like. When I was thinking about him, the first thing to pop into my head was just the big silver flying Dorito from the Michael Bay franchise, and then I looked at him and I was like, oh wow, these are his colors? I really didn't think about that. His color combination is a bit weird, and I didn't love playing around with it, but I wanted to stick with it. He's got a bunch of red, a bunch of gray, a bunch of blue and or purple, depending on the franchise you're looking at, and then this big yellowy orange thing down his front, which is like the window of his jet when he's in his vehicle mode, but I didn't really know what to do with it. I put it there because I felt like it had to be there, but it really ends up making this character look like Shazam, kind of. I tried to lean away from that a little bit in the colors, but it does end up looking a bit Shazam-like, and it doesn't help that I gave the character a hood. But for the Decepticons, I was going with the dark, evil sorts of knights, so I wanted to give them, hoods. That just tends to look more like an evil character thing. It's not always, but I think it generally is more of a bad guy kind of trait. And again, it had been a little bit hard to decide what weapon I was going to give him. Went with bow and arrow because I hadn't really seen any images of him with a melee weapon or one that he was famous for using. And because he's famous for, flying, I wanted to have him leaping through the air. Again, I had thought about doing some fantasy elements, maybe make him some kind of magic flying character, but I was like, no, let's try and stay away from traditionally fantasy elements, stay a bit more realistic. And honestly, I did the bow and arrow because I really just wanted to do a character partway through pulling an arrow off their back. It reminded me of one of the biggest animation challenges I've ever had in terms of rigging a character, which I guess the biggest one I've ever had was actually animating a Bumblebee transformation, which I did on the channel ages ago, but another one was animating Hanzo for the Score Esports when I worked there, and having a character rig that could pull an arrow off his back, load up the arrow, and shoot it, and be able to animate that quickly, seamlessly over and over again. But I've probably talked through that process before on the channel or something, so I'll try and stop going on tangents for the rest of this. I hope you like our Starscream, not totally a knight, a bit more of a ranger, but anyway, here he is. Alright, 3 down, 1 to go. This last one has to be the best evil-looking medieval knight that also represents Megatron. Think I can do it, I'm feeling confident. Also, as a side note, this is another one of those episodes that got voted on by subscribers. You can check for new polls and hints on what an episode's gonna be in the community tab, but it's also more likely to just show up on your news feed if you're a subscriber. So, subscribe if you want more stuff like this and you want to vote on what I'm drawing. But anyway, on to Megatron, then quickly the background. Let's do this. Now, Megatron presented some challenges as well. Not as many as Starscream, but definitely more than Bumblebee and Optimus. Because with Bumblebee and Optimus, they have very consistent color schemes in all of the franchise versions of Transformers that they're in. Bumblebee's pretty much always yellow with some gray, and Optimus pretty much always has blue helmet, red upper body, blue legs, and then some gray in there. With Megatron, he's largely gray in most cases, with a few splashes of red and purple in there. I definitely wanted to work those in, but mostly I was going to be working with a very gray, desaturated character. So I knew I had to think more about the shapes and the emotions, sort of. So one thing I had to do was make a helmet that was similar to the head shape of Megatron, which wasn't too hard because there is a medieval helmet style that has that sort of look. It's kind of like the Magneto helmet, which I realized partway through this drawing that I was making it too Magneto-like, and I changed it up a little bit in the inking stage, but it does still end up looking a bit Magneto-like, but it does also have the medieval armor look that I was going for. And then his pose, I figured like a arm raised kind of angry face, menacing, like I'll get you kind of look. Figured that worked pretty well for Megatron. I'm happy with that. I think it conveys Megatron well enough, while also obviously being a good pose for an evil knight kind of character. But the big thing that I think helps sell this as Megatron is the weapon I gave him, which isn't a weapon that I've seen Megatron use, I don't think, but his main go-to weapon in most things is that giant cannon on his forearm. And obviously I couldn't do that because I'm not leaning so far into fantasy and it's definitely not a sci-fi character, but I figured that shape could be translated pretty easily into a giant medieval mace kind of weapon. And the way I did it here, it's obviously a bit more fantasy-like because I made it inhumanly huge. Like a normal human couldn't actually lift that weapon and use it in a realistic way to swing and hit people with. But it was kind of necessary for that weapon to be that huge because it needed to represent a gigantic cannon, or be the visual equivalent of that gigantic cannon. And I like how it does look kind of heavy because in this pose, I have it kind of leaning down against the ground, sort of implying that it's such a heavy weapon that when he's not swinging it at people, he has it kind of resting on the ground a bit. For the amount of time it took, I guess it looks a little bit simpler than I thought it would, but regardless, still really like it. Megatron as an evil knight. And finally, we're into the background, which is really just a bit of a wind down at this point. I do a generic-ish me PopCross kind of background, which is just characters near a sort of cliff's edge with some trees and mountains and clouds in the background. I'd drawn all of these characters with some orangey rim lighting, so I knew I'd want to make the sky sort of a brightish yellow to reddish kind of color. And it came out pretty smoothly. You know, I don't have a hard time drawing these backgrounds anymore. They're kind of fun and mindless to draw. And I guess as I'm sort of wrapping up with the background here, I should say I'm sorry if anyone's disappointed that there's not a story in this episode. I'd thought about doing one, but also I really like doing some episodes where I just talk about my art process, especially if it's an episode where I'm trying to learn how to draw something, because I figure there's probably other people trying to learn how to draw this same kind of stuff, and they can learn some things from what I'm learning. And maybe there's some helpful information in what I was trying to use to learn the stuff that other people can use. I'll probably have some lore or stories in the next episode, but I hope people like this one anyway. And our drawing is wrapping up. I love how it looks all unified together, and I hope you all do as well. Here is our big medieval Transformers Knights mural. Well, alright, I am super happy with how this piece came together. I think from a medieval armor design standpoint, I do still have a lot of work to do. Odds are it wasn't gonna be something that I just get great at in one project, but I am feeling a lot more confident. And I think next time maybe I should just lean more into the fantasy side of things. In general, I prefer drawing fantasy stuff anyway, so, why not? Now, if you did enjoy me talking about my art process in this episode, you will very likely love the YouTube show / podcast that I was on this week, Art Friends, run by some people that a lot of people in the PopCross community will already know. It's a show with Cohen, Apolia, and Coda, just talking about lots of different art stuff. And I had listened to a few episodes and actually asked them if I could come on, and they were nice enough to say yes. So we talk about building an audience on something like YouTube, and I get to tell some funny stories that I wouldn't normally tell on this channel. It's a lot of fun, so I'll link the episode in the cards and the pinned comment and description. I highly recommend you check it out and a bunch of their other episodes. And if you want more Transformers stuff on this channel, I actually have an episode from a while back, that was another sort of learning episode like this, where I was teaching myself to draw mechs and robots. So you might want to check that out. But anyway, that's all for today. I'm Christian Pearson. This has been PopCross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Leave me suggestions for other stuff I could do with Transformers, or really whatever, and I will see you all in the next episode. Thanks for watching, everybody. Goodbye.